Hello, you're watching Scotland at 7. It's Hugh Stewart here in the Glasgow studio, and tonight on day 14 of the invasion of Ukraine, I'm going to be joined by Peter Curran, who's in the east part of Scotland just now. Good evening, Peter.
Good evening, Hugh.
And if you haven't seen Peter with us before, Peter is a writer now and a former business executive, and we'll have a lot of opportunity to discuss with Peter, looking at his experiences over the years, the various issues that I've thrown up today. But first, Peter, I'm going to quickly run through the update of the latest from Ukraine. Our first story is that Lumen Technologies, one of the companies that comprises the backbone of the internet, said on Tuesday it was pulling the plug on Russia because of what they call an increased security risk. Lumen attempted to downplay the impact of the decision, saying in a brief statement that it provides extremely small and very limited business services in Russia, but it is part of the network that allows data to flow through the infrastructure of the internet. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that the international community would be responsible for a mass humanitarian catastrophe if it did not agree to a no-fly zone, and has warned that the country was at maximum threat level. In his daily televised address, he said Ukrainians had shown throughout the last 2 weeks that they would never give in. Ukrainian state power operator says that the Russian forces have disconnected the Chernobyl nuclear power station from the grid, according to Reuters. Kiev authorities hope to evacuate many more people from Irpin, Bucha and Hostomel, the Ukrainian capital's deputy mayor said today. He also said that heat, water, power supplies and phone connections were working normally in Kyiv. European Union member states have agreed new sanctions against Russia's leaders and oligarchs over the invasion of Ukraine, reported Reuters. The French presidency of the EU said that members approved the sanctions at a meeting, and they will be formally adopted at the EU summit in Versailles, which takes place this Thursday and Friday. The Russian Foreign Ministry has claimed that its goals in Ukraine would be better achieved through talks, and that it does not plan to overthrow the country's government. According to Reuters, it said that 140,000 Ukrainians had fled to Russia and that its actions in Ukraine were strictly following its plan. In America, congressional leaders in the US reached a bipartisan deal early this morning to provide $13.6 billion to help Ukraine and European allies. President Joe Biden originally requested $10 billion for military, humanitarian and economic aid, but the backing from both parties was so strong that the figure climbed to $12 billion on Monday and finally $13.6 billion yesterday. Ukraine's government has banned exports of rye, barley, buckwheat, millet, sugar, salt and meat until the end of this year, according to a cabinet resolution published on Wednesday. It will put food security across Europe into sharp focus, leading to shortages of grain and price rises of staples, including the price of bread. Civilians have started leaving Sumy in private cars after a humanitarian corridor was established for the second consecutive day. The mayor of the northeastern city, Alexander Lysenko, made the announcement in televised comments. That's Sumy, near the border with Russia, in the northwest of Ukraine. EU leaders gathered for a summit in Versailles, we've said, on Thursday and Friday, and they're expected to say that Russia's aggression constitutes a tectonic shift in European history, according to a draft of the communique seen by The Guardian. They will decide, says the draft statement, to take more responsibility for security and to take further decisive steps towards building our European sovereignty. A Russian airstrike has reportedly killed 47 civilians as they queued for bread in Chernihiv on Thursday, which was on Thursday. It may constitute a war crime, an investigation by Amnesty International has found. That was on last Thursday. And around 12:15 on the 3rd of March, the square was hit by multiple bombs, killing civilians and severely damaging buildings. The number of people who have fled Ukraine since the start of the Russian invasion has now reached 2.1 to 2.2 million people, the UN Refugee Agency said today. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, said during a visit to Stockholm that rather than talk about which countries refugees will go to, the time is now to try to build help at the border. Britain has announced a series of new aviation sanctions giving the government power to detain any Russian aircraft in the UK. One of Ukraine's deputy prime ministers has said that the Russian armed forces have agreed to stop firing in areas of humanitarian corridors from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. local time, that's 7 p.m. GMT. Today, Irina Vereshchuk said that evacuation corridors would be open on Wednesday in several areas, including Mariupol, but warned Russian forces against shooting in these areas. Some 17 people have been wounded after a Russian airstrike reportedly hit a children's hospital and maternity ward in the city of Mariupol this afternoon. The governor of Ukraine's Donetsk region, Pavlo Kyrylenko, said some of those injured included women in labour. He accused Russia of carrying out the strike during an agreed ceasefire period that was meant to follow the evacuation of civilians from the besieged southern city. So, Peter, those are really the quick bullet points of what we've learned today. So there's certainly no sign at all of this ending anytime soon, is there? So, as the President Zelensky said, quoted Churchill yesterday, I'm wondering if this is the end of the beginning. Do you fear we're going to be talking about this crisis for quite a long time this summer?
What can you say in the face of it? What's happening? Putin is realizing that it wasn't going to be as easy as he thought it would be, and he's escalating it. He's going through it. He's trying to satisfy his Russian audience that this is still a military operation, not a war. And he's trying to protect them, as he sees it, from the truth. And he's doing everything to suppress the free flow of information and ruthlessly suppressing any form of demonstration against it. His only choice, given his rationale and his apparent psychology, is to escalate the war. I mean, since the era of Clausewitz, the world's been in the situation that total war ultimately is the principle that operates. Now, the advent of nuclear weapons changed the dynamic of that, but the realities of it are still there. He is effectively coming close to carpet bombing. And just remember, not in any sense to make value judgments or change blame, remember that the first nuclear bombs, 2 of them, were dropped by America on a country that didn't have nuclear weapons. Indeed, nobody else had. It was the total war concept. We've won the war in Europe. We're at war with Japan. We're experiencing very high casualties. We'll experience more. We have to stop it. And they were used. Britain, at a stage in the war, firebombed the city of Dresden, knowing that the casualties would be vastly predominantly men, women, and children being burned alive. So these are the kind of dynamics. Putin is going to get worse. I mean, he's already bombed people on what he claimed was a safe corridor. The day he's bombed a hospital, he cannot have been unaware of that. It is going to get worse until something significant happens, and everything hinges on what that significant something is going to be. We've got many measures in place. We've got the sanctions in place. We've got the economic sanctions. We've got the help with material things. We're cutting them off from a whole range of things. But none of these seem to be, or are likely to be, in fact, a magic bullet. So things are going to get worse. And that's a depressing conclusion. But it's the only prediction I can make from the present situation.
Yep, I'm afraid sitting here, yeah, it looks like that. Just as you said, it clearly suggested. Well, we heard from the Guardian last week that both food and fuel for some of the people in the front of that convoy stuck for 2 weeks now towards Kyiv had been given food or fuel for about 3 days. So that kind of suggests he thought that they were going to roll over. So the fact that it's not gone according to plan, and that's of course what Putin says every day, it's going according to plan. No, it isn't. So that means he can't go back now, can he? He can't go back and say, Okay, forget the whole thing. Bad idea. We're going home. He's just got to press on. So the logic is it's going to get worse. But let me just move on next to you said, Peter, what can we do? What kind of strategies can we in the Democratic West put in place? Now, of course, the issue that's been raised not only today, but also when Boris Johnson went to Poland last week was a question of a low-fly zone. And of course, it was also raised by President Zelensky yesterday when he made his televised address to the House of Commons. In fact, he's demanding no-fly zone. He's saying, isn't he, that the atrocities such as that bombing on a hospital are largely coming from the air. That's what he's saying. It's airborne missiles fired from bomber jets. So he's saying we have to have the ability to shoot those down. Right, so first of all, do you happen to know about this? I don't know. Is it possible maybe to use handheld ground-to-air missiles? Will the British response simply be, well, we're not going to go in, we're not going to start a war with Russia, but we're going to give you truckloads of these missiles so you can do that yourself? Is that what Britain's doing, you think? We don't want to go there, do we? We don't want to put boots on the ground.
Let's take the first part first, Hugh. To my horror, when I reflect, it's not so long since I was on this program, making fun of Vladimir Zelensky's name and the fact that he'd been a former comedian and he was now president of Ukraine. And nothing that I knew or anybody knew could have led us to realize how this man could have risen to the demands placed on him in a way that's almost unparalleled certainly in relatively modern history. I mean, the man is moving towards greatness. He's brave, he's unselfish, he's a man of the people, he's prepared to stand by the people, and he has, even through the mouth of a translator, the gift of rhetoric, and he will inspire and hold his people. It's entirely understandable that he should ask for us to establish a no-fly zone, because that's what makes his people most vulnerable, bombing from the air. And it's vital, absolutely crucially vital, that we say no to that no-fly zone. In my view, there is no ifs and buts in this. The NATO position and the West position, such as a common position, is that would almost certainly lead to the need to shoot down a Russian plane. Now, it's like setting a speed limit. If you set a speed limit, you have to be prepared to enforce it. And if you enforce it, you're going to upset the drivers. There's no avoiding this. But in war, many wars, including the last two world wars, in significant part, were launched on misconceptions and mistakes. And a no-fly zone would almost inevitably result in an engagement. And bear in mind, we are not talking about a NATO member. We're not talking about anybody that we have, a country that we have any sort of agreement with. I'm not saying that I'm not totally behind this country, but I'm saying there is nothing that formally commits us to doing this. In fact, I think we should fall to our knees in gratitude that, in fact, Ukraine was not a member of NATO, because by this time I think we'd probably be looking at the ashes of the planet. I don't think people realize the scale of the risk. I say people talking about the wider media and wider commentary. I think the hard-nosed real politicians in NATO and the military do understand this.
Now, so, I think I was just going to come in there, Peter, to discuss an interview given by Nicola Sturgeon today. Perhaps she's the first senior British politician to have broken rank, if you like, because there is really quite a lot of unanimity. I don't know if that's going too strong, but both in America, both from Antony Blinken and from NATO, from Jens Stoltenberg, and indeed from Boris Johnson, people have said exactly what you've said. We don't want to take that step, which might be the final step that humanity takes. But Nicola Sturgeon suggested today, well, maybe we shouldn't rule it out. Now, let's just discuss the words and what exactly is the nuance in there. Nicola Sturgeon said today, this was in an interview with ITV Border, on the one hand, she says, we share the concerns that a direct military confrontation between Russia and NATO a no-fly zone might lead to direct confrontation. And of course, we know what the concerns are. However, she went on to say perhaps the only thing nuclear weapons are derailing is the ability to properly and directly help Ukraine. She says that, well, yes, what we're talking about is the risk of everything escalating into nuclear war. But she's saying, if we stay, I think she's saying this, if we say right now to Putin, whatever you do, we're not going to take that step, is that not just giving a green light to Putin to continue?
Well, we've no idea how this will impact on Putin, but we have a pretty good idea how establishing a no-fly zone and engaging with a Russian plane would be received by Putin. I didn't see the broadcast, so I don't know exactly what Nicola said, but as I understand it, Nicola was probably asked by the interviewer, would you rule out a no-fly zone? Now, anybody who rules out anything in a dynamic, ever-changing, volatile situation like this is a fool. There's no telling how the dynamic of this would change. The danger in saying this is, as I know to my course in industrial relations, which is a form of ongoing conflict between power groups, that if a union comes to you and says, are you going to have a redundancy this week? You say, no, of course we're not. Do you rule out redundancies for the immediate future? The company says, no, we can't say, we can't possibly say that because of the unknown volatile business environment. The union says, got you. You're not ruling it out, therefore you're going to do it. So I wish Nicola had been able to avoid making any comment on ruling out, but I do understand now, helped by a discussion with a more intelligent person than I earlier this evening, why she said it. So in a sense, she was right to say there's a certain danger. If we start picking isolated quotes from politicians, which will range from the sensible and statesmanlike to the stupidity that they sometimes launch into in Twitter, blogs, and God knows where, we've got to be very careful about what we do to the public mood on this. The public mood here in Europe, in the NATO countries and in Russia, such as it can be accessed, is a vital component about how this should go. So I think we have to hold hard to the moment. No, we cannot accept a no-fly zone in the situation as it stands. Now, if somebody says, what if they go for carpet bombing? What will we do then? The core argument for not having a no-fly zone still holds, but it will become increasingly harder politically to hold that position. So I have no easy answers to this. It would take a strategist with powers far beyond anything I could summon to have an answer to this. And I suspect they don't have an answer, but they have a series of things that they're doing, and they're trying to do it best. So that's my view on the Nicola. I don't fault Nicola in any sense. I think she, in most cases, is statesman, stateswoman-like, statesperson-like at the gender program, right, and says the right things and guards her lip. But we have to be careful about picking out.
You have to be careful indeed. As far as I can see, she's the only major politician who's moved the language onto that direction that perhaps we should consider it. But obviously, as I said before, President Zelensky has already been saying, well, Zelensky's actually demanding, isn't he, saying to the West, if you don't do this, then we're dead, isn't he?
I didn't hear the broadcast, but I'm certain as anybody humanly can be. I hope that Nicola didn't say, I think we should consider this.
Let me see what she. Yeah, okay. Well, I'm just looking at her actual words. She is saying, well, she actually did. I'll just quote another piece of her words today. The world cannot stand by and watch Ukraine's independence and sovereignty be extinguished. So I wonder if we are prepared to do that. We don't want to see Ukraine absorbed into greater Russia, but I'm asking this question myself too. Would I want to make a personal sacrifice to defend Ukraine?
There's a simple answer to that here. The world cannot stand by and watch Ukraine's sovereignty as a democratic nation be destroyed and people be killed. The reality is that is exactly the same question about can we risk a nuclear war by declaring a no-fly zone. The reality is the world, if it takes a rational, and I put that and remove all human aspects from it, emotional, may have to accept the price of the Ukraine being extinguished to avoid devastating the planet, killing tens of millions, all of living things, and destroying civil society and order as we know it. That's the game we're in. We can't ramp up the emotion and say we cannot let this happen to Ukraine. We don't want it to happen to Ukraine. It would be a crime to let it happen to Ukraine. It would be appalling. It would be agonizing. But we do not have an answer for the nuclear question.
That's really what it all boils down to, isn't it, Peter? It's about, you mentioned rationality a couple of times, and so did the First Minister, but the whole mutually assured destruction thesis is based on rationality, isn't it? So we hope that rationality continues. So obviously that debate isn't going to go away as long as this crisis continues. But we're going to move on to another aspect of it now, which is, as we reported earlier on in today's news, over 2 million refugees are expected to have left Ukraine, most of them going west, most of them passing through neighbouring countries like Poland. So the UK response, of course, has been famously rotten. Ian Blackford, in fact, raised that point before, and he did, in fact, bring that question up again. Let's see if we can get that clip, because Prime Minister's Question Time took place this morning, as usual, on Wednesdays at Westminster. And turning to the question of visa requirements for people fleeing Ukraine, this is what Ian Blackford had to say.
Ian Blackford.
I don't think the Prime Minister understands the scale of the challenge or the urgency. These are people fleeing war crimes, torn apart from their families as their homes are shelled, and the Home Secretary is blocking them with endless paperwork. This isn't just incompetence, this is ideology. In the face of the biggest refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War, the UK government won't set aside the hostile environment. And by the way, we're seeing the hostile environment this afternoon. They might quieten down a bit. We've seen this too many times from a Tory Home Office. The Windrush scandal, the go-home vans, the inhumane Nationality and Borders Bill. The UK Home Office is raising barriers and bureaucracy when we should be offering care and compassion. Prime Minister, do not let the history of failure repeat itself. Scotland stands ready to offer sanctuary and refuge. So will the Prime Minister join with the rest of the European continent and waive the visa restrictions for refugees fleeing war in Ukraine?
So it seems that the main difference between Britain and the other European countries is the requirement to have the correct paperwork if you're fleeing. So people whose houses might well have been bombed, people whose neighbourhood might have been flattened, as they run away with whatever they can carry, they're supposed to make sure they go and get their documents with them. But anyway, I think the main point is, let's first of all ask, is it incompetence? Is it the British aren't capable of setting up a system, or is it just that, well, frankly, we don't want to let these people in here? What's your opinion?
Well, never ruling out incompetence with Boris or any of the people he has in the cabinet, some of whom are spectacularly incompetent. I think quite simply, this is Toryism, Brexitism in operation. This is the closet racism that underlies the whole of the Tory party's ethos and its behaviour throughout its long, disgraceful life. And this is the kind of racism that was inherent and still appears to be in the Home Office. As somebody said, I think it was today on some political forum, there hasn't been an issue in the last 40 years in which the Home Office hasn't made it worse. You know, Theresa May established a hostile environment. Brexit was sold in the hostile environment. You heard Boris saying it again today. He tried to waffle over, go to all the grandiose gestures to Zelensky and the standing ovation, which was wonderful, emotional moment. I don't deny that. But when pinned down, he said they are not prepared to relax checks and let anybody into the country. They've still got this paranoid feeling that the foreigner, is potentially an alien being in our midst. Even if they come to be a fruit picker, even if they come in desperation, fleeing from death and disaster, in among them there may be a few spies. Well, there may be. But that is a price worth paying, for God's sake. It's a price worth paying in humanity. We should let these people in. No, sort it out later. Do what you can later to establish credentials, make things up. At the moment, open the bloody gates.
Yes, at the moment. In his previous question today, Ian Blackford pointed out that already Ireland has taken in 3 times more people than the whole of the UK. Ireland, a country of 5 million people.
Country, proportionate to us. I mean, I sometimes wonder if there's a Tory with a human bone in their body, any sense of empathy with people outside the Westminster bubble. It's quite appalling. Callousness is being displayed at every level, and was being on other, which now seem lesser issues before this. They've really got, just open the door to these people, take the risks. If there are baddies among them, we'll deal with that. The baddies get into our country every day of the week effortlessly because they've got the money. But we're packed with Russian oligarchs.
We've got no problem letting oligarchs in, indeed, as you say. In fact, there probably are many more oligarchs in than we have refugees.
But not only letting them in, but fostering them, nurturing them, making them friends, and soliciting fat donations from them to the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party has a moral leg to stand on in this.
Yes, I know that's another of the issues that's coming up again and again. I'm just going to briefly say that on my Twitter, a lot of people have been making remarks about that, about where is the funding, about a lot of people have been saying, just to digress a minute, Peter, for example, Westminster managed to produce a report on John Bercow yesterday, that came out, but they still haven't managed to produce the Russian report, which was commissioned about 4 years ago, which was looking into that very question of funding from Russia. However, I diverse. I'm just going to go back to the question of visas. Today, the Home Affairs Select Committee in London heard from Vadim Pristaiko, who's the representative from Ukraine, and he said that waiving visa requirements would definitely resolve all the issues for refugees from Ukraine trying to get into the UK, and that the Ukrainian embassy stands ready to assist the UK. Calling for drastic measures to be taken, the ambassador said, I believe something like dropping everything, I think he means the requirements, should be considered as well. And Stewart MacDonald, who's the SNP's shadow Home Secretary, said that the pleas of the Ukrainian ambassador should not fall on deaf ears, and he demanded immediate action to bring more fleeing Ukrainians to the UK. Stewart MacDonald went on to say, making these perilous journeys to flee war and terror shouldn't have to wrestle with bureaucratic red tape to find a suitable place of refuge. So it's looking really like the red tape is really just an excuse, isn't it? In fact, we've heard ridiculous stories about people arriving perhaps penniless at one place in France and then being told they've got to go to Brussels or they've got to go to Paris with the right bit of paper. And in fact, if they don't get there by 4:30, everybody will have gone home anyway, and they don't work weekends. So although I note what you said earlier on about incompetence, but that's just barriers, isn't it? And you only put barriers if you want to stop something happening.
Stuart MacDonald, incidentally, acquitted himself more than honourably on Politics Live, flanked by 2 Tory women, one a former Tory advisor, the other a Tory MP, and had Alistair Campbell on the programme. And Alistair Campbell, although he had some points, he actually clearly had a lot of admiration, and quite a rare thing from Alistair Campbell, for Stuart MacDonald's performance. And I clipped it and then had problems with the clip. It got quite a lot of hits during that time. Stuart, by the way, is the defence spokesman. I don't know if he's also shadow Home Secretary, but he's certainly the defence spokesman for the SNP in the Parliament. And he was really very, very impressive. If only got a better pair of specs, it would have been even better. But who am I? Who am I
Well,
to talk?
I know who. Yes, I know. Let's not get into that side of it. Aye, my MP actually, Stewart MacDonald, is. I'm have to check. Is he the? I know he is Defence Secretary. Is he Shadow Home Secretary as well? I'll check that. Maybe it's two different. Aye, there's two different people of the same name, mind you. Yep. So there's actually two of them. Okay, so let's move on. I don't know if this story from America is connected in any way, but well, I put three stories together because from Reuters, both today and last night, after we went off the air, there are three different stories, Peter, of the American right wing, the far right of America, and the Trumpist plots over the last couple of years. Because there are three different legal cases, and so dealing with the first one. The trial begins with today of four men who were accused of plotting the kidnapping of the governor of Michigan, and they were actually trying to kidnap the governor 2 years ago because they believed that she was a tyrant because she shut the gyms during the COVID pandemic. So they intended to. It's been accused anyway that they intended to tie her up at gunpoint and march her away somewhere and then put her on some kind of trial. So they're defending that, of course, and saying well, it was just talk, we didn't really mean to do it. Secondly, we've also heard that the former leader of the Proud Boys, which is a far-right kind of neo-Nazi group, a guy called Ernesto Tarrio, has now been arrested. His name's been mentioned over the months since the attack on the US Capitol just over a year ago, the attack which was trying to prevent the certification of Joe Biden's election victory. So Tarrio has now been accused of being involved in organising that conspiracy, although he wasn't actually there. But nonetheless, the prosecutors have added his name to the prosecution anyway. And thirdly, we've heard today that a lawyer, a famous Trump-supporting lawyer, Sidney Powell in Texas, might be facing disciplinary moves from the Texas Bar Commission. This is because she took a number of cases to court where she alleged that millions of votes for Trump had been switched for Biden. She made that allegation on a TV interview. I'm not sure if that's what she took to court. But nonetheless, the Texas Bar Association has said that the allegations that Powell made were nonsense. She had no evidence and they were frivolous. And so the Texas Bar Association is annoyed at the lack of professionalism of a lawyer wasting the court's time, basically. So those are three cases which happen to have come together again. I'm just wondering if this means that we've seen the end of the peak Trump, of the peak Brexit, that idea that the right wing, 5 years ago was going to sweep away, sweep all opposition and triumphant. Do you see that's the ebbing of a flowing away of that move towards misinformation and Trumpism?
No, I don't at all. I think there's very little evidence to suggest that that's the case. However this particular case comes out, just remember an infinitely more significant, I'm not suggesting this isn't significant in its way, an infinitely more significant case, one that looked much more likely to succeed, has just collapsed totally. And that was the Manhattan DA, the real life law and order Jack McCoy, trying to nail Trump. And it resulted in a complete collapse of the case with these key prosecutors resigning. These people are hard to nail. They're hard to nail because they're not only embedded in the BAM pots of the electorate in some of these states and the radical far right, they're embedded in the legal profession. I'm not suggesting that of the DA Manhattan group, but they're embedded in the legal profession and they're very, very powerful people. The far right hasn't gone away. And to some degree, the more you attack the far right with democratic legal procedures, the greater the likelihood you drive them further into extremism. This is evidence for their paranoia. This is the state out to get them. And at the end of the day, we're not all that far from another American election. Anybody who thinks Trump won't still be a contender at that point is not looking closely at what's happening in America. And I think we have to do that because in combination with all that's happening with Russia, to have another Trump-like person back. That's assuming we're still a planet in the solar system by the time that comes around. The far right is very, very difficult to deal with. But they must be dealt with, if necessary, by draconian measures. They cannot be allowed to get away with criminality and literally murder.
Well, it certainly is the case that the US, the prosecutors are moving against these people. For example, I think I found out today that there's over 700 people have already been sentenced for the sort of thing that Tarrio is accused of, you know, the attack on the Capitol on the 6th of January last year. So something like 700 people have already been arrested. He could face 20 years in jail for the charge of trying to prevent due process, or whatever it's called. So they are moving on it.
Let's hope you're right, and that does impact on them. But for example, as the Supreme Court, they were trying to deal with the redrawing of the boundary lines. And again and again, the Supreme Court has ruled against what you would think of as rationality and equity and justice. So it's a worrying scene. I hope they're successful. And I hope they throw the book.
And of course, one of the things that Trump did in his last months was to make sure that there was a Conservative majority on the Supreme Court. But they didn't actually all agree with him. Or they don't think that just because he put them there, they have to agree with them and everything. So maybe there's checks and balances in the legal system. But before we move on from that, what about the idea of Russian influence in right-wing politics, both in America and here? For example, the Russia report from the members of Parliament in Westminster, to which I was referring, the small report, says that Americans were worried about the amount of Russian money, Russian influence in the UK Conservative Party. But there's also there's a lot of allegations that people in the right wing of the Republican movement are also quite open supporters of President Putin. You probably heard quite a lot of people in the fairly Trumpist right wing really saying making statements that show they admire Putin. So is there any sense you think that one of Putin's strategies has been gradually to eat its way into the political system, both in the conservatives here and among the Republicans in America?
The idea that this is a new development, Soviet influence has been endemic in world politics since 1917. They've always, America's went through a huge period of paranoia about the existence of it. The problem was they were looking in the wrong places. The idea that the major powers are not massively trying to influence each other within their systems. And America has spent most of the last decades of the last century interfering actively and in subversion ways in the behavior of democracies throughout the world. You know, so it would be naivety to think this wasn't happening. I grew up in the era where the Morning Star was the regular paper consumed by people in the moderate left. They used to say, well, yes, I know, but, you know, Russia maybe have killed 20 million of their own people, but you have to understand it's a huge historical. I've watched the left making excuses for Russian excesses throughout the whole of my life, and they were still doing it at the time of the Skripal poisoning. There was still people saying, well, Putin's not such a bad guy. We don't believe he could do this. And it was probably our own porting down and some skullduggery. I mean, the capacity of the population to believe a load of old bollocks is quite extraordinary. So yes, I'm sure they were trying to. What you can be sure of is the powerful in the Republican Party are interested in two things: money and power. They will judge Putin purely on whether it adds to their wealth and adds to their power, and they will dump him rapidly if they think. When you have the likes of major companies, and I may cite one, there's an interesting thing in the news about it tonight, fascinating, McDonald's. Now people say, you know, burgers, McDonald's. When the McDonald's opened after the fall of the wall, or sometime after the fall of the wall, opened in Moscow, it was a major world event. There's no other way to describe it. The Russian people flocked this was their relief. This from being excluded from the world and the delights of the West, the ability to go into McDonald's and buy a hamburger or whatever it was they were buying. McDonald's pulling out has had a significant impact on the psyche of the Russian population today. But there was a Putin apologist on a Russian saying, when Russia had to accept McDonald's, it was the infiltration of Western values into Russia. It was an appalling act. We have now rejected that, and in rejecting McDonald's and all that goes with it, we are asserting the rights of sovereign Russia. These are the kind of narratives that are operating, and this is the kind of crisis in which where you buy your sausage roll may matter significantly in politics. It's an extraordinarily complex game. But I think by and large in the sanctions and in the withdrawal of all these things that are associated with the good life from Russia, we're certainly on the right lines, because ultimately solutions to Putin have to come from within Russia, in my view.
I'm sure that's an issue which we will be looking at, and I would like to be able to say what is the opposition in Russia, but I don't have enough information on that just now. But I'm sure you've seen, like I have, plenty of pictures of people demonstrating in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and thousands have been arrested apparently. But there is an opposition, but who knows if that's going to be strong enough to cause any or to provoke any kind of palace coup. There's a lot of issues I'd like to discuss further with you there, but let's just move on though, because of course this isn't going to go away. Back to UK politics now. Peter, we hear today that the report says the cost of living crisis will have fatal consequences for some families across the UK, according to a leading anti-poverty campaigner. Speaking in front of the Work and Pensions Committee this morning, the writer and author Jack Monroe outlined I'm speaking American for some reason, outlined the devastating impact the cost of living crisis will have on households, leaving many eating less and skipping meals. Ms. Monroe said the impact of the cost of living on those households is going to be, in some cases, fatal, and that's not a term I use lightly. She went on to say the general cost of living crisis has gone up to a point where people have less to spend on food in their household expenditure. People are just eating less and skipping meals. The SNP's Shadow Fair Work and Employment spokesperson, who's Chris Stevens MP, is urging the Chancellor to use his upcoming spring statement to deliver a comprehensive package of support to tackle this crisis head on. So the spring statement, I think it's a kind of a mini budget. I haven't looked up when that's due. So again, this is another story about the fact that things are getting very expensive in this country. Inflation is going up, but wages and pensions are not going up by the same amount, so people are having to make really drastic choices. So Jack Monroe's actually saying, yeah, this is going to kill some people. People are not eating well, and this is indeed going to be fatal. So we're crisis in the midst of plenty, Peter. What do you see is the way out?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the cost of living has killed people throughout my life and throughout history. It's in the very nature of it. I think unless you've experienced real poverty, you never really know what it feels like. I do. I don't want to parade yet again my misery credentials for this, but I was brought up by a widowed mother. I lost my father at the age of 5 during a war. So we were really on the borderline. We had an uncertain tenancy, probably an illegal tenancy, in a house. We were on the brink of being thrown out. My mother had a derisory widow's pension at that time, which was barely enough to keep us alive. If it hadn't been for the fact that everybody was on rationing, I didn't actually realise how poor we were. And it was literally hand to mouth. I mean, by the end of the week, we were just scrabbling for things to eat. These things happen. I have to say, people have become accustomed to a lifestyle, even people on moderate incomes, which is now going to die. There's no other word for it. I mean, we cannot go on with the ordinary working family or moderate or low income, owning 2 cars, having 2 continental holidays, spending hundreds of pounds on a pop concert or these things. I don't want to sound like some latter-day Puritan. I like spending money like everybody else, but we are headed for one massive belt tightening. The belt will be so tight that the buckle touches the spine, and we'll have to get used to it. It's going to happen, and there's no way around it. I mean, net zero targets would have produced a lot of that alone without all the additional burden of COVID and now a bloody war and the prospect of nuclear extinction.
Well, that raises you raise many points there. Let's first of all deal with the point of, I guess you would call it the expectation of improving prosperity, because contrasting a modern childhood or my childhood, maybe just a few years after yours. I wasn't born in the years of rationing. But since then, of course, we have improved our standard of living. Everyone's got central heating. That's why we have to go to net zero, because we're all burning gas. People expect to live in houses where there's a separate bedroom for all the children. And as you say, have at least 2 cars per household. So there's been this expectation really throughout my life that rising generations are always going to have more material things. So do you reckon we're at another turning point in human society, that's not going to happen any longer? This constantly rising prosperity, that's a thing in the past.
Well, somebody used on the television earlier tonight the grossly overworked metaphor. The tectonic plates have moved. They were trying to suggest, I can't remember the context, that this was a positive shift. Tectonic plates moving are never a positive shift. And a reminder of the inherent instability of the little rock with a fireball at its centre that we live on. And the movement of tectonic plates might ultimately destroy a huge swathe of California as the San Andreas Fault splits. So, I mean, that's about the only thing missing from the cocktail at the moment. We've had a pandemic, we've got threats of a nuclear war, we've had COVID, all that goes with it. So all we need is a major earthquake in the key decision centres. I think we're headed for hard times are coming, and maybe we need them. Maybe will cleanse the soul of the West.
You're sounding very Scottish now when you get into that kind of language.
I'm actually a 3 parts Irishman, but that quarter part Scottish is a bit puritanical. I was brought up as a devout Catholic, but I think I'm inherently a Covenant.
I wonder though if we really need to reevaluate what we mean by prosperity anyway, because you did mention that the move over to net zero, I take it what you mean is that means less economic growth, less stuff. Is there any way that, is there an optimist in you? What I was wondering, Peter, is whether we can we have a good life? Can we all as a nation have a happy life, but with less stuff? Can we start doing things that don't involve digging up something out of the soil or burning something, but just go and enjoy ourselves more, doing something that's fun?
I didn't mean that at all by net zero. I'm talking about the pursuit of net zero emissions for climate change, which will be the main impact on our cost of living, notably the problems of abandoning our views on what central heating should be and the use of fossil fuels. So, but I do think we need to remember the old television series, Hugh, The Good Life. I mean, it was a comedy series and people laughed at the way they pursued the good life and self-sufficiency. But there was an inherent wisdom and a desirable thing in that we were all living an ephemeral kind of life which defined what was the good life, and it wasn't the good life. The good life is having enough to sustain you, to give you food, shelter, protection from threat, maintain your health, and be able to be surrounded by your loved ones and pursue some artistic or social or sporting endeavour. It doesn't take a lot to have the good life. And a lot of the trappings we have added to it now are really not necessary.
So it's probably, well, if we do move to net zero and a green economy, I think there probably will have to be different ways of measuring what we mean by success. And that's something we've discussed before. The Scottish Government actually is officially committed to producing some sort of index of general well-being, which isn't just the same as increased GDP. But I don't think economists have entirely agreed what kind of things you should put into that. But certainly we are reaching a stage where we don't seem, the capitalist market economy doesn't seem to be able to produce continuing growth. And that's certainly not going to happen this year with sanctions, of course, which I think, as you hinted earlier on, hit both sides. So economically, it's going to be difficult. And I'm going to finish tonight with another story on the economy. And this is a new report which highlights a positive impact SNP's policies are having on families across Scotland. This report, commissioned by the Child Poverty Action Group, the CPAG for Scotland, analysed the impact of policies including child payments, free school meals, clothing grants and free bus travel on the cost of bringing up a child. Professor Donald Hirsch, the author of the report, has said it shows that in Scotland, families are significantly better off as a result of Scottish Government policies. Professor Hirsch said it is encouraging to see policies at Scottish level that make a substantial difference for families. Commenting, the SNP's MSP Cock-up Stewart, who was on last night, said, it's encouraging to see evidence that SNP policies are reducing the financial challenges facing families right now, from expanding free, high-quality childcare to protecting families' incomes by being the only part of the UK to have the child payment. One of 5 of our family benefits that the SNP in government is supporting that's one of 5 family benefits, she said. The SNP in government is supporting families across Scotland where we can. So I guess that's a big 3 cheers really for government action, in spite of what we said earlier on about the slowing down of progress, right? But that looks like, well, I think governments are back now, aren't they? What with the banking crisis and then massive government support during the COVID crisis. This is saying if you have a social problem, it is possible for the government to devise a plan to deal with it. So are you a government optimist? Do you think governments can make things better?
Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't be a Democrat and a voter and support the concept of a state if I didn't believe that. I mean, I believe in the structure of a social state, and I believe that governments must be effective. I mean, there's very seminal work written recently about the nature of confidence and the role confidence plays in all human activity. And confidence is in 2 parts, and that they're mutually dependent. Confidence is the belief that you have the abilities by your actions to achieve something, that you have the skills to change things. But the other part of it is the belief that if I apply these skills, it will change things. And there are people who are confident that they have the ability to do it, but have no confidence about their ability to impact on the society around them. I mean, what we've been suffering from, I think, since the end of the Second World War and the end of the initial period of austerity, is a lack of confidence in the population's belief that they can influence governments. And when they are suddenly possessed of a belief that they can, they've got an uncanny knack of latching onto the wrong bloody thing. And Brexit was a classic example of that. People who felt powerless in the face of government, felt that nothing they did mattered, nobody was listening to them, were suddenly given a series of lying prospects that made them believe they could achieve a tectonic shift. And they did just that. A desperately bad tectonic shift, the Brexit vote, and these tectonic plates have left the economic world shuddering ever since. So we've got to restore that belief that the voter can change society. I mean, one of the problems with the SNP throughout my membership of it, I'm not a member any longer, has been my experience, very limited experience, inability to influence central policy in any way. The branches were essentially ignored. And if any branch would like to stand up and say they successfully changed policy, God bless them, I congratulate them, and they should be elevated to independent sainthood immediately. But the SNP has been appalling at engaging with its membership. I believe the SNP is well motivated. It has excellent people, and I was delighted to have my faith restored in watching Stewart MacDonald. I still believe in the SNP. I don't believe yet that I have anything to contribute within the party. I believe I can only contribute, but I vote for them, and I will vote for them. And I believe in independence.
So obviously the SNP has been in power since I think it was 2007. Before that, we had the Labour Liberal coalition. But whoever's in power, you could say that this is actually an argument in favour of devolution, because the report makes it clear that the Scottish Government has taken certain actions which have not been taken south of the borders. So this is definitely a three cheers for devolution, isn't it, no matter who's in power?
No, it's not. It's a recognition that even a limited relaxation of the choke chain, which is Scotland's member of the way of controlling the union, that will give you a little leash to run. In that little limited run we have, we can perform better than the UK. Think of the wonders we could perform if we had the whole bit that the choke chain was removed and we ran free. Whether the SNP will be the right vehicle to do it, I don't know. But I believe Scotland, and its people and its resources, all its history would suggest we have the capacity to make the most of our independence. And I still think it's the first duty of any manager or any politician, given objectives, is to define the resources we need. The resource we need above all others is total independence, total, free, sovereign, full independence. And then we can really show what we can do. And I welcome what we've done.
Well, yes, I'm not going to disagree with you. In fact, a number of the issues we've raised tonight really underline the limits you were talking about. In fact, Scotland would like to have a different policy on allowing the refugees to come in, but of course, the devolution settlement does not allow us to do that. So that's just one example of how we are actually constrained. But what I meant really was, if devolution works, then independence will work more. That would be a logical argument, wouldn't it?
We're in complete accord on that, Hugh.
But just finally, before I move on from that point, among defenders of the Union, it's very common, as you'll probably have noticed, Peter, to denigrate Scotland. It's just completely normal for people in the House of Commons, Conservatives, to stand up and say, look at the mess they're making about education, look at the mess they're making of this, that and the other. But and a lot of indicators you look at, Scotland is actually outperforming the rest of the UK. So that doesn't annoy you a bit, that kind of nonsense that gets talked all the time, not backed by any evidence at all. Here is evidence that the Scottish Government is working.
No, it doesn't annoy me. In fact, to some degree, I rejoice on it because it shows the total failure of the unionist argument. That to say to a people where at least half of the population want to be free and independent, you are not capable of being independent. To insult them, they should be congratulating us on what we're doing and saying, think of how that will exemplify the wonders of devolution, etc. The whole unionist argument is flawed, and they don't seem to realise that. That's why they're terrified of a referendum. There are hard people within the unionist camp who know that this time we will win a referendum if we have one. And now, unfortunately, the whole defence NATO thing produced by the Ukraine crisis has altered that dynamic very significantly. They are never going to grant us a referendum now because of the nuclear aspect. That would cut to the very heart of this whole new solidarity of NATO. We're going to have to fight for independence. I mean fight politically and democratically as far as we can. We're going to have to fight as Scotland, not in the framework of UK law.
Right, so we'll finish on that point, Peter. Scotland in the world, Scotland having its ability to make its own decisions and the very dismal background that we have at the moment. So we're going to end up there. So you're just getting warmed up, Peter. I'm sure you could do another couple of hours because you've had your tea, I've no. So I'm just going to draw a halt to it now. And so thanks, first of all, to Peter Curran, writer and former business executive, for joining us again. It's always useful to hear what you think about the issues, Peter. And finally, I'm also going to thank our regular viewers and our supporters, because it is you who keep Broadcasting Scotland going. Now, we could do with some more money. We do hope to be able to expand the range of programmes we can offer, and as soon as more money comes in, more programmes will be put out. So if you'd like to join existing supporters, please have a look at the link which is below me there, and if you could sign up to a wee standing order, redirect debit, that would help. Every penny that comes in just helps us to make more programmes. So thanks for watching, thanks for being a supporter, and it'll be Maggie tomorrow, and I'll be back on Friday. So from me and from Peter Curran, that's it for tonight. Good night.
Good night, Hugh.